The wind howled through the endless stretch of white as Daniel Carter pulled his coat tighter around his body. The snowstorm had come in faster than expected, turning the already harsh winter into a blinding nightmare. His boots crunched through the fresh snow as he made his way back to his remote cabin, his breath visible in the freezing air. He had spent the day gathering firewood, but now, with the storm worsening, his only focus was getting inside before the cold became unbearable. Then he saw it. At first, Daniel thought it was just another mound of snow, shaped oddly by the wind. But as he moved closer, something caught his eye. A faint shimmer, a reflection of light that didn't belong. Frowning, he approached carefully. The snow was piled high, but something was underneath. With a growing sense of urgency, he brushed away the ice and froze at what he found. A woman. She was barely visible beneath the layers of snow, her form fragile and unmoving. Her skin, though eerily smooth and pale, had a strange translucent glow that made Daniel hesitate. She wasn't wearing any real winter clothing, just a thin bodysuit, covered in frost, barely protecting her from the deadly cold. Her lips were a deep shade of blue, and her long silver-white hair was stiff with ice. Daniel dropped to his knees and pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. For a long, terrifying second, he thought she was already gone. But then, faint, barely there, he felt it. She was alive. "Hang on," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. There was no time to question who she was, or where she came from. She wouldn't last much longer in the cold. He had to get her inside. Now, without hesitation, Daniel lifted her into his arms, her body limp and freezing against his chest. She was incredibly light, as if she weighed far less than she should. He ignored the thought and focused on the storm ahead. With every step, the snow fought against him, trying to pull him down, but Daniel refused to stop. The storm wasn't going to claim another life today. Minutes later, inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire was a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. Daniel kicked the door shut behind him and hurried to lay the woman on the couch, his mind racing. He quickly grabbed a blanket and wrapped it around her, but the moment he touched her ice-cold skin, he knew it wasn't enough. She was too cold. Her body wasn't shivering, a bad sign. That meant her body had already given up trying to keep warm. Hypothermia was setting in. If he didn't do something, she wouldn't make it. Daniel rubbed her hands, trying to create some warmth. Her fingers were long and delicate, with nails that looked almost crystalline. Everything about her was otherworldly. Yet right now, she was just a person in need of help. "Come on," he muttered, gritting his teeth. "Wake up." No response. Daniel hesitated. He didn't know if it would work, but he had no other choice. He had read about it before. When someone is close to freezing to death, direct body heat is the best way to warm them up. For a moment, he debated the idea. It wasn't exactly something he was comfortable with. But then he looked at her pale face, her lips barely parting as she struggled to breathe, and his hesitation vanished. With careful movements, Daniel removed his outer layers and wrapped them around both of them, pressing her against his chest. She was so cold. It was like holding a block of ice. He adjusted the blankets, making sure no cold air could get in. Then he simply held her, hoping that his body heat would bring her back. Time passed slowly. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. Daniel could feel the cold draining from her body little by little, but it still wasn't enough. He had no idea if it was working, but he refused to give up. Then, just as he was starting to lose hope, he felt it. A faint twitch in her fingers, a shallow breath against his chest. Daniel stiffened. She was waking up, and the first thing she did was whisper something in a language he didn't understand, soft and weak, but filled with something he couldn't explain. His heart pounded. Who was she? And how did she end up here? Daniel barely breathed as he felt the woman move in his arms. It was a small movement, just a weak twitch of her fingers. But it was enough to make his heart race. She was alive. For hours, he had kept her close, letting his body warmth fight against the deadly cold that had nearly taken her life. The fire in the cabin flickered softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the blizzard still howled, but inside, the woman's shallow breaths were the only sound that mattered. Then she whispered something. Daniel tensed. The words were soft and unfamiliar, spoken in a language he didn't recognize. It wasn't English, and it definitely wasn't any human language he had ever heard before. His grip on her tightened slightly. Who was she? Slowly, the woman's eyelids fluttered, revealing striking violet eyes. They were glassy and unfocused at first, but as she blinked, confusion flashed across her face. Her gaze landed on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel saw fear in her expression, uncertainty, wariness. She was in an unknown place, held by a stranger, and likely had no idea what had happened to her. He raised his hand slightly, showing her he meant no harm. Hey, you're okay. You were freezing out there in the snow. I brought you inside. The woman's breathing was slow, but she did not look away from him. Her delicate fingers clutched at the blanket wrapped around her, as if trying to understand what was happening. Then, to Daniel's surprise, she spoke again, this time in broken English. Where am I? Her voice was soft, weak, but there was a strange melody to it, as if the words were foreign to her tongue. Daniel exhaled, relieved that she could at least communicate. You're in my cabin. I found you outside, buried in the snow. You were freezing to death. She frowned, her mind clearly struggling to process the information. Then, as if realizing something, she touched her own face, feeling her cold skin, her damp silver hair. A shadow of alarm crossed her features. My ship, she murmured. Where is my ship? Daniel's brows furrowed. Ship. He hadn't seen any kind of wreckage nearby. He had only found her, alone, half buried in the snow. I don't know, he admitted. I didn't see a ship. Just you. She inhaled sharply, and for the first time, fear truly settled in her expression. No, 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 no. Her hand gripped the blanket tightly, her breathing becoming uneven. Daniel immediately sat up straighter. Hey, take it easy, he said. You were half frozen when I found you. You need to rest. But the woman shook her head. I cannot stay here. They will come. Her voice trembled, and Daniel could see genuine fear in her violet eyes. Who? He asked, his stomach tightening. Who's coming? She hesitated, as if debating whether to tell him. Then, finally, she whispered, the Zycran enforcers. Daniel had no idea who, or what, that was, but the way she said the name sent a chill down his spine. You're in danger, he said, more as a statement than a question. She swallowed hard and nodded. Yes. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. He had no idea what he had just gotten himself into. Finding an alien woman half frozen in the snow was one thing, but now she was on the run from something dangerous. Look, he said, keeping his voice calm. I don't know what's going on, but you're safe here, for now. No one knows you're here. The woman looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she relaxed slightly, her grip on the blanket loosening. What's your name? Daniel asked. She hesitated again before softly saying, Aaron. Daniel nodded. I'm Daniel. Aaron's eyes flickered to the fire, then back to him. You saved me. Daniel gave a small shrug. Yeah, I couldn't just leave you out there. Aaron stared at him, something unreadable in her gaze. Then, to his surprise, she said, But why? Daniel blinked. What do you mean? In my world, Aaron said quietly, most would not do this. They would leave a stranger to die. Daniel frowned. He didn't like the sound of that. Well, I'm not from your world. For the first time, a hint of something that almost looked like a smile touched Aaron's lips. It was small, barely there, but it was real. She looked at him again, this time with less fear and more curiosity. And Daniel had a feeling his life had just become a lot more complicated. The wind outside had calmed, but the air inside the cabin was still heavy with unspoken questions. Daniel watched as Erin shifted slightly under the blanket. Her violet eyes flickered toward the fire, the warmth of the flames casting a soft glow on her pale skin. She looked exhausted, her body still weak from the cold, but there was something else in her expression. Caution, hesitation. She didn't trust him. Not yet. And Daniel couldn't blame her. He had no idea what she had been through. No idea who or what was after her. All he knew was that he had saved an alien woman from freezing to death, and now his quiet life in the wilderness was about to change forever. Erin finally looked back at him. "You are a human." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she studied him, as if searching for something unseen. Then, after a moment, she said, "I have heard stories of your kind." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Oh yeah? What kind of stories?" Erin hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "Humans are unpredictable." Daniel smirked. "That's one way to put it." Erin's expression remained serious. "Some say your people are dangerous. Others say they are different." Daniel exhaled. "Well, I guess that depends on who you meet." She was silent for a moment, then said softly, "You did not leave me to die." Daniel shrugged. "Like I said before, I couldn't just walk away." Erin tilted her head slightly, her silver hair falling over her shoulder. "Why?" Daniel frowned. "Because it was the right thing to do." Erin's eyes held his for a long time. Then, slowly, she nodded, as if accepting his answer, but not fully understanding it. She pulled the blanket closer around herself, then looked at the cabin around her. "Where is this place?" "My cabin," Daniel answered. "We're deep in the mountains. Closest town is about 50 miles away." Erin's brow furrowed. "No one else is here." Daniel shook his head. "Just me." She exhaled, looking almost relieved. Then she whispered, "Good." Daniel didn't like the way she said that. It confirmed his suspicion. She was running from something. He sat forward, resting his arms on his knees. "You mentioned the Zycran enforcers. Who are they?" Erin stiffened. Her hands clenched the blanket, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "They are the ones who control my people." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Control." Erin hesitated, then finally whispered, "Slavers." Daniel's jaw tightened. "They were after you." Erin nodded. "I was being transported, a prisoner. But something went wrong. My ship crashed, and I escaped." Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. This was worse than he thought. If she was telling the truth, then she wasn't just a lost traveler. She was a fugitive. And if these Zycran enforcers were really slavers, then they wouldn't just give up looking for her. Daniel looked at her again. "So what happens now? Are they still tracking you?" Erin swallowed hard. "I don't know." That wasn't the answer he wanted to hear. Daniel stood up and walked to the window, peering outside. The storm had finally started to die down, but thick layers of snow covered everything. If anyone was out there, they'd leave tracks. "Did you have any kind of tracker on you?" he asked without turning around. Erin hesitated. "I don't know." Daniel turned back, eyes narrowing. "You don't know?" She shook her head. "If they placed one on me, I was not aware." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Great, just great." He ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter. He was just a guy living in the wilderness trying to get away from the noise of the world. And now he was harboring an escaped alien prisoner being hunted by slavers. Fantastic. Daniel sighed. "All right, listen. You're not going anywhere until we figure out if they're still looking for you." Erin frowned. "But." "No buts," Daniel interrupted. "You're still weak, And if these guys are as bad as you say, then wandering around in the snow is a death sentence. You stay here, rest, then we'll figure out what to do next." Erin opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she closed it again. She studied Daniel for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "All right." Daniel exhaled. "Good." He sat back down near the fire, glancing at her one last time. He could still see uncertainty in her face, but there was something else too. A flicker of trust. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and something told Daniel that this was only the beginning. Daniel woke up to the sound of the wind howling outside. The blizzard had lessened, but snow still covered everything in sight. The fire in the cabin had burned low, casting faint shadows on the wooden walls. Across the room, Erin was still wrapped in blankets, her silver hair falling over her shoulders as she stared into the fire. She looked deep in thought, her violet eyes distant. Daniel sat up and stretched. "You should get some more rest," he said, his voice slightly rough from sleep. Erin looked at him. "I have rested enough," she said softly. "My body is healing." Daniel frowned. "Healing? You were half frozen yesterday. You don't just heal from that overnight." Erin hesitated, then finally said, "My kind, we recover faster than humans, but my strength is not back yet." Daniel studied her. He didn't know much about aliens, but Erin didn't seem to be lying. There was still a slight weakness in her posture, but her face had more color now. She was definitely stronger than the night before. "Still," Daniel said, standing up, "you should eat something. I'll make us some food." Erin nodded but didn't reply. Daniel grabbed some supplies from the small kitchen area: dried meat, bread, and a pot of leftover stew he had made before the storm. He placed a bowl in front of Erin. She hesitated, looking at the food. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Not hungry?" Erin glanced at him. I do not know if I can eat this." Daniel frowned. "You don't eat human food." She took a small breath. "I can, but some things affect my body differently than they do yours." Daniel crossed his arms. "Well, unless you have some alien food supply hidden somewhere, this is all I've got." Erin gave him a small, amused look. Then, cautiously, she took a bite of the bread. She chewed slowly, as if analyzing the taste. Daniel watched her. "Well." Erin swallowed and nodded. "It is acceptable." Daniel smirked. "Glad to hear it." They ate in silence for a while, the warmth of the fire making the small cabin feel safe and peaceful, for now. But Daniel knew this was temporary. After a few minutes, Erin finally spoke. "What do you do here, Daniel? Why live alone in the mountains?" Daniel took a sip of water before answering. "I like the quiet. No traffic, no crowds, no noise. Just me, the trees, and the sky." Erin tilted her head slightly. "You do not wish to be with your people." Daniel shrugged. "I don't hate people. I just needed a break from everything." Erin studied him, as if trying to understand. "Humans are strange." Daniel chuckled. "Yeah, I hear that a lot." Erin's expression softened slightly, but then she turned serious again. "The Zychron enforcers, if they are looking for me, they will not stop." Daniel's smile faded. "Yeah, I figured that much." Erin looked down at her hands. "If they find me, they will kill you too." Daniel exhaled. "Yeah, I figured that too." She blinked at him, surprised. "Then why are you helping me?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Because you needed help. That's it." Erin stared at him for a long moment. Then finally she said, "I do not understand humans." Daniel smirked. "You're not the first to say that." Later that night, the storm outside had calmed to a soft snowfall, and the world outside was silent. Daniel was checking the perimeter outside the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow. Everything seemed undisturbed. No tracks, no signs of movement. But something still bothered him. He turned back toward the cabin, his breath visible in the cold air. Then he froze. In the distance, far beyond the trees, he saw a faint red light flickering in the darkness. His stomach tightened. That wasn't natural. Slowly, he backed toward the cabin, keeping his eyes on the distant light. Then, turning quickly, he stepped inside and shut the door. Aaron immediately looked up. "What is it?" Daniel locked the door. "We might have a problem." Aaron's expression darkened. "They are here." Daniel clenched his jaw. "Not sure yet, but we can't take any chances." Aaron slowly stood up, the weakness in her limbs almost gone now. "If they find us, we must be ready." Daniel grabbed his rifle and checked the ammunition. "Yeah," he muttered. "I was afraid you'd say that." Aaron looked at him, then at the fire. "I owe you my life, Daniel Carter. I will not let you die because of me." Daniel smirked slightly. "Let's make sure neither of us dies, all right?" Aaron's lips curled into a small, determined smile. "Agreed." Outside, the red light blinked again. Someone, or something, was coming. And Daniel had a feeling that things were about to get much worse. The cabin was silent except for the crackling fire. Daniel stood near the window, his breath steady as he watched the faint red light flicker in the distance. His grip tightened around his rifle. He didn't know who, or what, was out there, but something inside him told him this wasn't good. Across the room, Erin was standing now, her strength almost fully returned. Her silver hair fell over her shoulders, her violet eyes focused on the same distant light. "They found me," she whispered. Daniel glanced at her. "You sure?" Erin's face darkened. Zyklon enforcers use tracking drones to scan for movement. That red light, it means they are searching this area. Daniel clenched his jaw. Just his luck. He had wanted peace and quiet, and instead, he had an alien woman on the run and slavers coming to kill them both. "Great, just great. We need to move," Erin said urgently. "If we stay, they will find us." Daniel thought for a moment. "No, if we run now, we'll leave footprints in the snow. They'll track us easily." Erin hesitated, then nodded. "You are right." Daniel took a deep breath. Think. He had spent years in these mountains. If they were going to survive, he needed to use that knowledge. "How many of them are there?" he asked. Erin closed her eyes for a moment, as if sensing something. "At least 3 Zyklon hunters. More will follow if they send a signal." Daniel cursed under his breath. 3 armed aliens versus 1 guy with a rifle. Not exactly a fair fight. He turned to Erin. "Do you have any weapons?" Erin reached into the torn fabric of her bodysuit and pulled out a small metallic device, a curved silver-like object no bigger than her palm. Daniel frowned. "What is that?" "A pulse emitter," she explained. "It sends out a shockwave that can disable electrical systems, but it is not meant for combat." Daniel exhaled. "Not good enough." "All right," he said, thinking fast. "Then we make this place look empty." Erin looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Daniel started moving. "We kill the fire, pack our supplies, and hide. If they check inside, we make it look like we already left." Erin caught on quickly. She nodded and moved to help him. Within minutes, they put out the fire, erased footprints inside the cabin, and gathered supplies. Daniel led Erin to a hidden storage space beneath the floorboards. "Get in," he said. Erin hesitated. "And you?" "I'll be close by," he assured her, "just in case." She looked at him for a moment, then reluctantly climbed down. Daniel covered the entrance with a wooden crate, making it look like just another part of the floor. Then he waited. Minutes later, a faint hum filled the air. Daniel held his breath as a small metallic drone floated past the window. Its red lights scanned the area, moving slowly, searching for signs of life. Then, footsteps. Daniel gripped his rifle tightly. pressing himself against the shadows. The door to the cabin creaked open. A low, mechanical voice spoke in an alien language. Daniel couldn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. They were looking for Aaron. Then, the floor creaked as something heavy stepped inside. Daniel risked a glance. 3 figures stood in the doorway. They were tall and armored, their exosuits black and sleek, with helmet-like masks covering their faces. Their yellow eyes glowed behind dark visors. Zycran enforcers. Daniel's heart pounded. These guys didn't look friendly. One of them spoke into a wrist device. A mechanical voice translated. No signs of life. The heat source has disappeared. Daniel didn't move. One wrong step, and they would find him. The tallest Zycran walked forward, scanning the room. He knelt by the fireplace, touching the ash. Too warm. Daniel knew what that meant. They would realize someone had been here recently. The Zycran stood up. Continue the search. Then, to Daniel's horror, the lead Zycran turned toward the hidden floorboards. They were about to find Aaron. Daniel's mind raced. He had to do something. He tightened his grip on the rifle. His best bet was a distraction. If he fired, they would turn on him immediately. But if he did nothing, Aaron was done for. Daniel took a slow, steady breath. Then he acted. With one swift movement, he knocked over a metal lantern, making it crash loudly against the wooden floor. The Zycrans whirled around, weapons drawn. "Show yourself," one of them barked. Daniel took his chance. He fired a shot at the ceiling beam, making snow from the roof collapse into the cabin. The Zycrans shouted as cold powder rained down on them, blinding their visors for a moment. That moment was all Daniel needed. "Aaron, now," he shouted. The floorboards burst open as Aaron jumped out, her pulse emitter in hand. She pressed the device, and a shockwave rippled through the air, making the Zycran's drone short-circuit and fall to the ground. Daniel grabbed Aaron's arm. "We run. Now." She didn't argue. They sprinted out of the cabin, disappearing into the thick snow as the Zycrans roared in frustration behind them. The hunt had truly begun. Daniel and Aaron ran through the snow, the cold air biting at their skin. Every step was a struggle against the thick snow, but they couldn't afford to slow down. Behind them, the Zycran enforcers were recovering from the shockwave, their heavy boots crunching in the snow as they followed. Aaron's pulse emitter had disabled one of their drones, but they still had the others. It wouldn't be long before the Zycrans figured out where they had gone. "Keep moving," Daniel shouted, his breath coming out in clouds. Aaron nodded, her feet steady despite the cold. The shockwave had given them some time, but it wouldn't last. The enforcers were relentless. They pushed forward, weaving between the trees, trying to make their trail less obvious. The wind howled above them, the snow swirling in all directions, but the pair pressed on, knowing they couldn't stop. Daniel's mind raced. He had no plan, no escape route. He was out of his element, but he had to protect Aaron. He couldn't let them take her. "How much further?" he asked, glancing at Aaron. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her eyes scanned the surroundings, her alien senses seemingly sharper than his. "There is an old hideout," she said, her voice calm despite the situation. "We can reach it if we hurry." Daniel nodded. He didn't ask questions. Right now, he was following her lead. A few hundred yards ahead, Aaron pointed to a rocky outcrop. "Over there," she said. Quickly. Daniel looked back. The Zycrans had split up, but one was still in pursuit, moving fast. They were getting closer. Without another word, Daniel grabbed Aaron's arm and pulled her toward the outcrop. It wasn't much, a natural cave of sorts, hidden among the rocks. They had to make it there before the enforcers caught up. As they reached the entrance to the cave, Daniel heard a voice call from behind them. "Stop." It was one of the Zycran enforcers. He was too close, his figure just visible in the snow, his yellow eyes gleaming through his helmet. Daniel's heart pounded. They couldn't outrun him. Without thinking, he pulled Aaron inside the cave. It was small but deep, providing enough shelter for the moment. They crouched low, trying to stay as still as possible. Daniel's fingers gripped his rifle tightly, every muscle in his body tense. He could hear the Zykrant's footsteps getting closer. Erin's breath was shallow, her eyes focused on the entrance. They will come for us. Daniel nodded. He didn't need her to tell him that. The Zykrans were closing in on their position. The chase had reached its peak, and there was no way out. Erin's hand moved toward the pulse emitter again. Daniel grabbed her wrist. No. Save it. We need to be smart about this. Erin looked at him, her expression unreadable, but she nodded, lowering her hand. The Zykran enforcer stepped into the mouth of the cave, his boots scraping against the rocks. He didn't see them yet, but it was only a matter of time. A moment later, Daniel heard the crackling of his voice transmission. The enforcer was calling for backup. Daniel took a deep breath. "We can't fight them all," he whispered. "I know," Erin replied quietly. "But I can slow them down." Daniel looked at her, unsure. "How?" Erin's violet eyes glowed softly as she whispered something under her breath. For a moment, Daniel could feel a faint energy in the air, a pressure building, like the calm before a storm. Then, without warning, Erin thrust her hand out, and a shockwave pulsed through the cave, shaking the walls. Daniel's ears rang as the Zykran enforcer staggered back, stunned by the energy blast. But he wasn't down for long. He quickly recovered and drew his weapon. Erin turned to Daniel. "It will not last. We have only a few moments." Daniel nodded, knowing the next step was crucial. He couldn't waste any more time. He peeked out from the side of the cave entrance and saw the other two Zykran enforcers coming into view, their dark silhouettes stark against the white snow. They had weapons drawn, and it was clear they weren't here to talk. "We need to make a run for it," Daniel said, gripping Erin's arm again. "No," Erin said firmly. "We fight." Daniel looked at her in shock. "What? Are you crazy?" Erin gave him a determined look. "I will not let them capture me. Not again." For a moment, Daniel hesitated. He knew she was right. They couldn't just keep running. But he didn't have the luxury of time to think it through. Erin stepped forward toward the cave entrance, the pulse emitter in her hand. She aimed at the oncoming Zykrans. Daniel knew she was about to use the shockwave again. Before he could stop her, Erin fired. A blinding burst of energy erupted from the device, hitting the first enforcer and sending him flying back. The other two Zykrans raised their weapons, but the blast had disoriented them just enough to give Erin and Daniel a precious few seconds. Erin grabbed Daniel's arm. "Now, run." They didn't hesitate. Together, they sprinted out of the cave, moving as fast as they could through the snow. The Zykrans were recovering quickly, but the brief moment of surprise gave them a head start. Daniel's heart raced as he looked over his shoulder. The Zykrans were closing in, but for now, they were ahead. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew one thing: they had to keep moving. The cold air bit at Daniel's face as he and Erin sprinted through the snow, the pounding of their footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of white around them. The wind howled above, making the landscape feel like an endless white desert, but they didn't dare stop. The Zykran enforcers were close, and their weapons were more than capable of catching up to them. Daniel's heart was pounding in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. His legs were starting to feel heavy, but he couldn't slow down. Erin was beside him, moving with an unnatural grace, her alien agility far outpacing his own. She glanced at him, her violet eyes sharp despite the circumstances. "We are being followed," she said. Daniel didn't need to look behind him to know that. The Zykrans were relentless. They'd never stop chasing them. "What do we do now?" Daniel asked, trying to catch his breath. Erin's expression was focused, her mind working quickly. "There is an old cave system nearby, a place I used to hide when I needed to escape." Daniel glanced at her. How far? Not far, she said, but we must move quickly. If they catch us, we won't have time to reach it. Daniel nodded. It was their best shot. He didn't like their chances of outrunning the Zykrans, but this cave system might offer the shelter they needed to outlast the search. With every step, the cold seemed to seep deeper into his bones. His body was tiring, but Erin's determination kept him going. She was counting on him, and he couldn't fail her now. They pushed on, weaving through the trees, the snow-covered ground offering little traction. Daniel's fingers were frozen, and his rifle felt heavier with every passing moment. But he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Then, ahead, he saw it, a narrow passageway between two large boulders, barely visible through the snow-covered trees. That's it, Erin said, pointing toward the opening. Quickly, Daniel's heart lifted. If they could make it there, they might have a chance. They would need to hide and wait for the Zykrans to lose their trail, but it was the best option they had. With the last bit of energy he had, Daniel rushed forward, his boots slipping in the snow as he tried to keep up with Erin. She was already moving toward the entrance of the cave, her footsteps quick and purposeful. They reached the opening, and Daniel squeezed through the narrow gap behind Erin. The cave was dark, cool, and smelled of damp stone, but it was shelter. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Erin motioned for him to stay quiet. She crouched down near a rock formation that jutted out of the ground, pulling herself into a small alcove. Daniel followed, taking cover beside her. They both listened intently. The sound of the Zykran enforcers was growing louder. Their footsteps were heavy in the snow, and the crackle of their communication devices could be heard faintly in the distance. They were getting close. Daniel's pulse raced as he tried to steady his breathing. They couldn't afford to make a sound. The slightest noise could give them away. Erin closed her eyes for a moment, her expression focused. Daniel wasn't sure what she was doing. Maybe she was trying to sense the enforcers' movements, or maybe she was just waiting for the right moment. Minutes passed, each one stretching out endlessly. The Zykrans were searching nearby, their voices low and cautious as they scanned the area. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of their footsteps began to fade. "They're moving on," Erin whispered, her eyes still sharp. Daniel didn't move at first. He waited, listening for any sign that they were still nearby. The last thing they needed was to run into the Zykrans in this cave. After a few more moments, Daniel finally relaxed. "We've made it," he whispered. Erin nodded but didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the dark entrance of the cave, her mind still alert, watching for any signs of danger. For a while, they just sat in silence, the only sounds coming from the occasional drip of water echoing off the cave walls. Daniel knew that this wasn't over, that they couldn't stay in the cave forever. But for now, they were safe. After a few minutes, Erin turned to Daniel. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel blinked, surprised by the gratitude in her voice. "What for?" "For not giving up on me," she said softly. "For helping me." Daniel exhaled. "I couldn't just leave you out there, Erin." She looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You are different from the others. You are kind." Daniel felt a small warmth in his chest at her words, though he knew they didn't have time to dwell on such things. "We've still got a long way to go," he said, his voice steady. "But for now, we need to rest. Get your strength back. We'll figure out our next move tomorrow." Erin nodded and closed her eyes, leaning back against the stone wall. Daniel sat beside her, keeping watch as best he could. For the first time in what felt like days, there was a moment of quiet peace, but Daniel knew it wouldn't last. They were still being hunted, and their survival depended on staying one step ahead of the Zykrans. But for now, in the safety of the cave, they had a brief reprieve. And that was enough.